victory songs. So thank you very much. We look forward to that. Our sermon is going to come out of the book of Esther. We're going to be talking about the story of Esther this morning. And I want to summarize as quickly as I can the story of Esther. So Esther was a Jew. She was living in exile in Persia. And Esther becomes the queen of Persia. But there's a guy there who hates the Jews. He wants to destroy the Jews. And so he convinces the king to pass a law that says, on a specific day, all the Jews are going to be annihilated. They're going to be executed. And Esther realizes that she has come to attain royalty for such a time as this. And she risks her life in order to intervene on behalf of her people. And she says, if I perish, I perish. But she risked her life. And she speaks to the king, and the king did not know that she was a Jew. And so the king understands that once a law has been passed, that law cannot be revoked. So there is going to be an execution of Jews. But he gives Esther his signet ring, and he says, you can write a new law and sign it with my ring, and it will have the authority of the king. So Esther writes a new law, and basically what the new law says is, on this specific day, the Jews will be allowed to defend themselves. Basically, making this a fair fight. And it turns out it wasn't a fair fight at all, because God was with his people, and God fought for his people. And on that day, all the enemies of the people of God were destroyed, and the people of God gained a lot of power. And Esther is credited for saving the Jews. She was a godly woman. She was a courageous woman. She risked her life in order to save her people. But Esther could not have done what she did if it weren't for a godly father. She had a father who had been training her for years, ever since she was a little girl, for this particular moment in time. And so our sermon this morning is called, How a Great Father Saved a Nation. Please turn in your Bibles to Esther chapter 2, verse 5. Esther chapter 2, verse 5. It says, now there was at the citadel in Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. We see Mordecai. Mordecai is not this guy's real name. The word Mordecai is a Babylonian word, and it means servant of Marduk. And Marduk was one of the Babylonian gods. The Babylonians had a tradition of, when they conquered people, they would take the important people of those who had been conquered, and they would give them a new name and a new identity. And this was a way to indoctrinate them, to try to get them to conform to Babylonian culture and Babylonian society. Forget who you've always been in the past, forget who you are, and become one of us. And usually the names that were given to these people were had something to do with the gods of Babylon or the greatness of Babylon, and it was a way of kind of subliminally reinforcing the message that Babylon is great and that our gods are the greatest and that you should be a servant of Babylon and the things that Babylon is doing. So Daniel's name was changed to Belteshazzar, and Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, their names were changed to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And Mordecai was given a name as well, Mordecai, the servant of Marduk. The thing is, this pressure to conform to Babylonian culture and society by giving them a new name and a new identity, it did not work with Daniel. And it did not work with Hananiah and Azariah and Mishael. And it also did not work with Mordecai. Mordecai was a man who always knew he was a Jew. In fact, right here in verse 5, it says, now there was at the citadel in Susa a Jew named Mordecai. He never forgot who he was. He never forgot that Jehovah was his God. And he was a man who was going to be faithful to Jehovah no matter what. Now take a look at verse 7. Esther chapter 2, verse 7. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther. Here we see Esther. Esther is not her real name. Esther is a Persian name, a name that was given to her. The word Esther means star, or some people think that the word Esther might be a reference to Ishtar, who was a Mesopotamian god, a false god. And so her real name is Hadassah. Hadassah is a Hebrew word, and the word Hadassah means myrtle tree. Myrtle tree. And I wondered why anyone would name their daughter Myrtle Tree. And so I did some research on that. And I found out that the myrtle tree is found in many different passages in the Old Testament. And the myrtle tree has come to symbolize righteousness or holiness. Now, I only want to read one Old Testament passage that talks about the myrtle tree to illustrate this point. But that is Isaiah chapter 55, verse 13. It says, instead of the thorn bush, the cypress will come up. And instead of the nettle, the myrtle tree will come up. Now, a nettle is a stinging bush. It's sometimes known as the stinging nettle. The nettle has a toxin that is very irritating to human flesh. So you don't want to be stuck in a bunch of nettles. But some versions of the Bible translate this word nettle as briars. Briars. So when I think of briars, I think of the briar patch. I think of a bunch of bushes that are full of thorns and thistles. And so what you have here is thorns and thistles. But the thorns and thistles are going to be replaced with the cypress tree and the myrtle tree. Now, thorns and thistles are the product of sin. When Adam and Eve sinned, the earth itself was cursed, and God said to Adam that now the earth is going to produce thorns and thistles. So thorns and thistles represent sin. And so what we see in this Isaiah prophecy is that thorns and thistles will be replaced by the myrtle tree. So the myrtle tree represents the opposite of sin. And what is the opposite of sin? It is righteousness and holiness. There are passages in the Old Testament where the myrtle tree represents the holy people of God. So this is a good name to give to your daughter. Esther is Hadassah. Hadassah, which means the myrtle tree. And she represents righteousness. She represents holiness. And it's interesting that Isaiah says that the thorns and thistles will be replaced by the myrtle tree. That is, sin will be replaced by righteousness and holiness. And what we see in the story of Esther is she is going to play a crucial role in the destruction of the enemies of God, those who have chosen to live in sin, so that the holy people of God could reign in their place. And so her name actually fits her life and what she accomplishes with her life. But let's read verse 7 again. Esther chapter 2, verse 7. It says, he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. What we see here is that Mordecai is Esther's cousin. Mordecai must have been much older than Esther. Esther had parents, but when her parents died, she was very young. I don't know how old she was, but she was a child, an infant perhaps. And Mordecai, her cousin, took her in and raised her up as his own daughter. Mordecai was a great father, and we're going to see the evidence of this in the story of Esther. So let's take a look at chapter 2, verse 8. Esther chapter 2, verse 8 says, so it came about when the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa into the custody of Hegai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Hegai, who was in charge of the women. Now the king of Persia is looking for a new queen. Who's going to be his wife? Who's going to become queen of Persia? Esther was taken into custody. And what that means is Esther didn't choose to go. Esther is not trying to become the queen. She's not saying, I want to be the queen, and she's doing all she can to get chosen. No, she didn't have a choice in the matter. They took her. And now she's in a situation that is out of her hands and out of her control. It's not necessarily her desire. She can't control the situation. So Esther was taken. But take a look at verse 10. Verse 10 says, Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. Mordecai tells Esther, nobody needs to know that you are a Jew. You need to conceal your identity. And the question I have is, why? Why does Mordecai tell Esther that she should conceal her identity? And the truth is, I don't have an answer to that question. I researched this. I read commentaries, I read articles online, wondering why it was important for her to conceal her identity. And I read a lot of suggestions. Maybe it was this, maybe it was that. But none of those suggestions were convincing to me. So I still don't have an answer to this question. However, notice what happens in Esther chapter 3, verses 2 through 4. Take a look at Esther chapter 3, verses 2 through 4. It says, all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why are you transgressing the king's command? Now it was when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reasons would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. Let's keep reading verses 5 and 6. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Now here we see that everyone is bowing down and worshiping Mordecai, or not Mordecai, Haman. But Mordecai is a Jew, and he refuses to bow down and worship Haman. Mordecai knows that Haman is not Jehovah, and that Jehovah is the only being who is worthy for us to bow down and worship him. So Mordecai has a conviction, and he's staying faithful to his convictions, even though he was warned daily, if you do not do what the king has commanded, you're going to get into trouble. You're going to be punished. You might even be executed. But Mordecai will not compromise his values. He knows that he should worship Jehovah and Jehovah only. And he refuses to bow down before Haman. And so he does this because he was a Jew. The Jews were a peculiar people. The Jews had a peculiar law. The Jews would not conform to a sinful culture and a sinful society. At least that was the ideal for the Jews. And Haman was a man who was living according to those ideals and values. Not Haman. Mordecai was a man who was living according to those ideals and values. See, by messing that name up, I just added like 15 seconds to this sermon. So, all right. Now I lost my train of thought. Okay, so Haman realizes that if this one Jew will not bow down and worship me, then it's likely that all the Jews will not bow down and worship me. And so all the Jews must perish. They're all going to be destroyed. Perhaps Mordecai knows that being a Jew is going to create problems for us. That we are a people who are going to be persecuted and suffer because of our convictions in the commandments of God and our desire to be faithful to God. Maybe Mordecai tells Esther to conceal her identity because he doesn't want her to suffer, because he doesn't want her to be persecuted. He wants her to avoid some of these problems that the Jews will typically have. I don't know, but the fact that she is told to conceal her identity is significant to the story. It's repeated twice in chapter 2. So take a look at chapter 2, verse 20. Chapter 2, verse 20 says, Esther had not yet made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther did what Mordecai told her, as she had done when under his care. So this is the second time that we read that she was told not to reveal her identity. And why was she told this? I don't know. But the why is not important. What is important is she obeyed Mordecai's instructions. And it wasn't just that she obeyed Mordecai's instructions now for the first time, but it says here in verse 20, as she always had obeyed him ever since she was a child. This is a girl who had been obedient to her father ever since she was a little child. But that says something about Mordecai as a father. Here was a father who had trained his daughter to obey him. We need fathers who will train their kids to be obedient. And how do you train a child to obey? Well, it requires hard work. It requires consistency. It requires discipline. Now, discipline is a word that our culture today does not like. There are a lot of parents today who don't want to discipline their children. They think that discipline is a form of abuse. But the Bible actually teaches that to not discipline your child is a form of abuse, and that discipline is an act of love. And a good father will discipline his children. They need to be disciplined in order to learn to obey. This involves correction. This involves punishment. This also involves rewards and love and hugs and explanations and instructions and encouragement as well. But it can be exhausting trying to teach a child to obey their parents. A lot of parents today do not teach their children to obey. A lot of parents today do not use the word no. But our kids need to be told no. It's good for kids to hear the word no. A child who always gets what he wants will think that the world owes him something. And a parent who always cleans up the mess that the child makes without having the kid clean it up themselves, it's easier for the parent to clean it up than to fight with the kid over cleaning it up. It's easier, it's quicker, I get it. But if we always do that, the kid is going to grow up and think it's not my responsibility, it's someone else's responsibility. And a parent who always sides with their children, every time their child gets in trouble, the child is in trouble with the coach, with the neighbor, with the teacher, with a police officer, and the parent is always siding with their kid, teaches their child that the child is innocent, the child is perfect, and everyone else in the world is prejudiced against them and is abusing them in some way. But we need to have parents, and fathers specifically, who are training children to be obedient. I've heard it said, the best time to tackle a minor problem is before he grows up and becomes a major problem. And so we need to address issues with our children when they are young. Why is it so important that children obey? This is a true story. There was a family who took shelter in a basement because there was a big storm coming through their town, tornadoes and everything. And once the storm had passed, they came up out of the basement. The father opened the front door, and he was looking outside to see what kind of damage the storm had done. And there were power lines that had been knocked down in the street in front of his house, live wires laying there on the ground. And his 5-year-old daughter ran past him out the front door right into the street. And he screamed at her, "Stop, stop, stop!" But she didn't listen to him, and she ran right into those wires. They electrocuted her, and she died. That girl died because when her father said no, she knew he didn't mean no. When he said stop, she knew he didn't mean stop. He didn't train her to obey when she was young, and it cost her his life, her life. Mordecai had trained Esther to obey. In fact, take a look at Esther chapter 2, verse 15. Esther chapter 2, verse 15 says, "Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, came to go into the king, she did not request anything except what Hegai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the women advised. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. This is a very powerful verse. It tells us here in verse 15 that Mordecai had taken Esther as his own daughter. We already know this. It's already been stated. Why does it need to be repeated again here? It seems like unnecessary information. It's redundant, that the fact that it's repeated again here. But I think it's repeated again here for a very specific reason. And that reason is because it explains Esther's behavior in this verse. Why does Esther do what she did? Esther does what she does because Mordecai was her father. And Mordecai had trained her and raised her in such a way that her behavior is a reflection of the greatness of her father. So what does Esther do here that's so significant? Now, Esther is going in to see the king, and Esther is allowed to take anything she wants with her when she goes in to see the king. But she doesn't ask for anything except for what Hegai advises her to take. So what did Hegai advise her to take? I have no idea. The Bible doesn't say. What Hegai advised her to take with her is not important. But what is important is she not only was obedient to her father Mordecai, but she also respected the authority of people around her. She listened to the advice of older, wiser people. She took their advice and put it into practice in her life. So you see Esther listening to someone who knows what they're talking about. And he says, I think you should take this. And Esther says, okay, I'll do that. You see, she didn't just obey her father. She also obeyed other people who were older and wiser and had authority around her. Well, I don't know what happened there, but I'll preach without it. Take a look at Esther chapter 2, verse 11. Esther chapter 2, verse 11. There it is. Kirk, our hero. Every day, Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. Where is Mordecai? He's in front of the court of the harem. Why is Mordecai there? Because he cares about Esther. She's his daughter. He wants to know where she is. He wants to know who's with her. He wants to know what's happening. How is she doing? He wants to hear word from Esther. He's a parent who loves his child, who is involved in his child's life, and who cares about the details of his child. When was Mordecai there? It says every single day he was there. Every single day. How involved was he in the life of his daughter? He was so involved that every single day he was present. Where is my daughter? That's where I'm going to be. Wherever she is, whatever she's doing, Mordecai was there because he was involved in the life of his daughter. In fact, take a look at verse 19. Verse 19 says, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Take a look at verse 21. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Take a look at chapter 3, verse 3. Chapter 3, verse 3. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, where is Mordecai? Every single day he's sitting at the king's gate. Why? Because he's invested in his daughter. And we need fathers who are invested in their children. We need fathers who are going to be present in the lives of their children. We need fathers who are going to be present in the home. We need fathers who are going to be home for dinner so that we can sit down and have dinner together at the table as a family. Now, that may not happen 7 nights a week, but it ought to happen regularly. A father's presence in the home should be a regular thing because our kids need their fathers. We need to be present at their activities. You know, who's going to coach that Little League team? Well, if my son is on it, I'm coaching the team because I'm going to be involved in the things that my kids are involved in. And I'm going to be at that dance recital. And I'm going to be at that choir concert. And I'm going to be at that school play. Why? Because my children are involved in those things. And if my children are there, I want to be there. There's a reason why I'm invested in the Singing Youth of Denver. Now, this is the truth. I care about all of the kids who are a part of the Singing Youth of Denver. They matter to me. And I think that the ministry of the Singing Youth of Denver is so powerful that it's going to have a long-lasting spiritual benefit in the lives of all the kids who participate in the Singing Youth of Denver. And I want to be a part of that. But my biggest motivation for being involved in the Singing Youth of Denver is because my kids are involved in the Singing Youth of Denver. And as long as my kids are a part of this, I am also going to be a part of it. Because I'm a parent who wants to be involved in their lives and in what they're doing. I know that when Emmett came into the youth group, he got to go on a trip to Oklahoma for a youth rally in Oklahoma. And then he got to go to Cheyenne, Wyoming for a youth rally in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And I think it was at that youth rally in Cheyenne, Wyoming, when it dawned on Emmett that I'm never going to go anywhere with the youth group where my father is not with us. I can't escape him. And I think in that moment, that might have been a negative for him. However, I think that when you look back on your life 20 years from now, you will be appreciative of the fact that you had a father who was invested in the things that matter, and he was invested in you, and he was there doing those things with you. We need fathers who are invested in our children. If someone wants to date my daughter, they're welcome to. But I want to know who's dating my daughter. If someone wants to date my daughter, he's got to come over to my house and spend time with me and my wife and my family. We're going to watch Nuggets games together. We're gonna do things together. We're going to eat dinner together. But I'm going to get to know this guy. I don't want some stranger just driving up, honking his horn, or sending a text and she run out. I don't know who this guy is. That's not going to happen. You want to date my daughter, you're going to spend time with me. I want to know you, and I want you to know me, because the fear of Steve is the beginning of wisdom. Seriously, though, I want him to know that I'm interested in the details. Where are you going? What are you going to do? When is she coming home? I want to know the details. And if the plans change, I need to know that the plans have changed. Okay? Because I want to be involved in what's going on with my children. When it comes to boys dating, I'm not going to turn Cody loose on the world here. Like, we need some coaching here. We need some training. I need to model for Cody how a man should treat a woman. What he sees between me and Carrie should impact him as a man growing up. And he's going to need to know that when you go out with this girl, you got to respect this girl, and you got to respect her parents. And if you want to date her, you got to spend time in her house with her parents, getting to know her mom and dad. You need to shake their hands, and you need to look them in the eyes, and you need to talk to them, and you need to communicate with them. You need to give them the details of your plans, where you're going, what you're doing, because you need to be that way with her parents as well. And so that's the kind of guy that Mordecai was. He was present and involved in the life of his daughter, and that's why Esther grew up to be such an incredible woman. Take a look at Esther chapter 4, verses 15 through 17. Esther chapter 4, verses 15 through 17. It says, "Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, 'Go, assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens and I also will fast in the same way, and thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish.' So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded him." This is the great thing about Mordecai. Not only did he teach his daughter to obey, but he also was humble enough to obey. When Esther gave him instructions, he listened to Esther. And he was willing to submit to her authority. And he was willing to do what she asked him to do. He taught her to obey, but he also was a man who was willing to obey. And men, we need to listen to our wives. We need to listen to our children when they speak to us. And there are times when we need to obey. Like, listen to your wife and do what she says. Listen to your children and do what they say. Because a man who can hear, take criticism, and then put it into practice to be a better man is a good man. You know, recently Carrie and I were having a conversation, and I could tell she was hesitant to say what she thought or felt. And I said in that moment, this is a safe conversation. I'm not going to get mad, but you can tell me what you think, you can tell me what you feel. And so she told me what she thought. She told me what she felt. And I hope my response was one that proved that it was a safe conversation, that I received that well, and that I would put it into practice and be better as a result of that conversation. But this is the kind of man that Mordecai was, that he was willing to listen to his daughter and do what his daughter asked him to do. So take a look at Esther chapter 8, verses 15 through 17. Let's go to Esther chapter 8. Verses 15 through 17, it says, then Mordecai went out. By the way, Mordecai has now been promoted by the king. Mordecai is now a big deal in Persia, okay? He's like second in command. He's like Joseph in Egypt. He's like Daniel in Babylon. Now there's Mordecai in Persia. So let's read. Esther chapter 8, verse 15 through 17. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a large crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. Mordecai is not the king, but he's dressed like the king, and he represents a king, or he is symbolic of a king. So imagine the king comes out, and everybody shouts and rejoices over the presence of the king. And what does the presence of the king mean for the people of God? Verse 16, for the Jews, there was light and gladness and joy and honor. When the king comes into the presence of his people, the people of God are blessed. Verse 17, in each and every province and in each and every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. Many people became Jews, proselytes. You have Gentiles who want to be Jews. So they became Jews. They became a part of the people of God. Why? Because the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. What does that mean, the dread of the Jews? The word dread means fear. The Jews were a powerful people, and others were afraid of them. But it doesn't just mean fear. It also means respect and awe. They respected the Jews, and they were amazed at the Jews. But it's not because of the Jews themselves. It's because of the God that the Jews served. They were a peculiar people who knew that Jehovah was the one and only God, and they would not compromise their values and convictions. And others were inspired by that, and they wanted to be a part of it. They were drawn to it. And so you have Gentiles becoming proselytes and living like Jews so that they could serve Jehovah. And isn't this a foreshadowing of what happens in the church today? God said to Abraham, in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. God wants to bring a blessing into the world which is for all humanity, not just for the Jews, but for all mankind. And in the church today, you have people from every race, speaking every language, with every color of skin, united together in one body, equals as Christians in the body of Christ. And that's what we see here. Take a look at Esther chapter 9, verse 1. 9 verse 1. Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, it was turned to the contrary so that the Jews themselves gained the mastery over those who hated them. Now, there was a time when you had to choose. Either you're with us or you're against us. And there were a lot of people who said, I'm with the people of God. And there were a lot of people who said, I'm against the people of God. So there were enemies as well. But what happens is the people of God were victorious over the enemies. Take a look at verses 2 and 3. Chapter 9, 2 and 3. The Jews assembled in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought to harm them. And no one could stand before them, for the dread of them had fallen on all the peoples. Even all the princes of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and those who were doing the king's business assisted the Jews because the dread of Mordecai had fallen on them. We have a lot of people who are helping the Jews against the enemies. Why? Because the dread of Mordecai had fallen on them. Mordecai was such a powerful man that people feared him. But people respected him. People were in awe of Mordecai. And because of his influence, many people made the right choice. They said, I want to be a part of what Mordecai is a part of. I want to serve the people of God like Mordecai. And they came and joined forces with the people of God. Why was Esther so powerful? It was because she had a father who was powerful. And he trained her to be a godly woman. And she grew up to be just like her father. So take a look at verses 4 and 5. Verse 4 says, Indeed, Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai became greater and greater. And then verse 5, Thus the Jews struck all their enemies, and the sword, killing and destroying, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. I think verses 4 and 5 are awkward. It's odd, because verse 5 seems to describe what's going on in this moment. And verse 3 seems to describe what's going on in this moment. But verse 4 seems to be describing what was going on over a long period of time in general. And it seems like verse 4 is out of place, sandwiched between 1, 2, and 3, and 5. You have verse 4. But I think verse 4 explains why verse 5 happens the way it happens. Okay? The people of God are victorious over their enemies because there was a great man of God whose influence was growing. And he was having an impact on the hearts and minds of people around them. And so the dread of Mordecai caused a lot of people to join forces with the people of God and be united as servants of Jehovah. The whole point of this sermon is this. Esther was a great woman. She saved a nation. She saved her people. She risked her life in order to save her people. But Esther was a great woman because she had a great father who invested in her and who trained her and raised her up for this particular moment in time. And what we need in the world today are great fathers, men who are invested in their children, but men who are men of God. And then invest in their children so that their children will grow up to be faithful to God as well. We offer an invitation at this time, and if you would like to respond for prayers to be a better father, to be a better husband, to be a better man, to be a better servant in the kingdom of God, or if you're struggling in any way, you can come forward at this time as we stand and sing the invitation song.